This is Jack's Nightmares broadcasting from a safe place. If you can hear me, you're one of the last. What you're about to hear is the story of a survivor, or at least someone who tried to be. Subscribe and comment if you're still out there. And now, let's begin. I've spent years perfecting my craft in the wilderness. Ever since I was young, I've been drawn to the forest, to its silence and majesty. As time went on, my love of nature evolved into a passion for big game hunting. I prided myself on patience, discipline, and a steady hand. People sometimes asked why I chose to hunt. For me, it was never about inflicting harm. It was about the challenge, the thrill of tracking something elusive, and the quiet respect a hunter holds for the land. Days in the forest bring a sense of clarity. Animals and trees don't judge. They exist in their own realms, bound by instincts rather than human constructs. Whenever I set foot on a hunting trail, I feel like I'm stepping into a different world. The wind speaks through the canopy, and fallen leaves provide the softest carpet imaginable. I never feel more alive than in those moments when I become part of that stillness. I'm there to hone my skill, observe, and on occasion, take a worthy trophy home. This particular expedition began like so many others. I had a new rifle, specialized gear, and a solid plan. Late autumn was the perfect season, cool temperatures, crisp air. The leaves were already turning shades of orange and gold, and I'd heard rumors of an unusually large buck roaming these parts. Local hunters spoke about it in hushed tones, calling it a legend. Some even claimed it was impossible to track, vanishing into the thickest parts of the woods without a trace. For me, the challenge was irresistible. I arrived at my usual spot before dawn. The narrow dirt road ended near a small clearing, so I parked my truck there, took a moment to look around, and shouldered my pack. My gear included binoculars, a canteen, and a few days' rations just in case. Then I set out on foot, following trails worn by deer hooves and the occasional boot prints from other adventurers. Each step felt deliberate. Twigs snapped under my boots, but the forest itself remained calm. I found signs, fresh scat, tufts of fur on tree bark, hoof prints in the damp soil. It felt like a normal day of tracking, and the sense of familiarity gave me confidence. I kept moving, scanning the surroundings, noting every detail. Hours passed, and nothing seemed amiss. Eventually, I found my vantage point. A sturdy oak with low branches, ideal for climbing. Its broad limbs offered a perfect perch, high enough to provide a view of the clearing below. From that spot, I planned to watch for any movement. Deer often wandered through this area around dusk. I perched there quietly, rifle across my lap, waiting for the sun to dip beneath the horizon. The sky glowed with a mix of pink and orange. A faint breeze rustled the leaves. Moments like this were the reason I hunted. The stillness, the beauty, and the patient anticipation of what might emerge. After an hour or so, a doe stepped into the clearing. She tested the air, ears swiveling. I stayed still, focusing on my breathing. I had no interest in taking a doe that day, but I wanted to see what else might follow. Sometimes a buck would be close by, trailing behind, or carefully checking the area before revealing itself. Suddenly, movement at the edge of my vision drew my attention. Something stepped out, tall, muscular, with a magnificent set of antlers. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with the rush of the hunt. This was the buck I'd heard about, I was certain. Its antlers looked like a crown, and the animal held itself with an imposing stature. I lifted my rifle, bracing it carefully. The buck turned its head, oblivious to my presence but fully alert to the forest. My vantage point offered a clear shot. Everything I'd ever practiced led to that moment. I steadied my aim, slowly exhaling, and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed among the trees. The buck jolted, staggered, and dropped to the ground. I watched it collapse behind some bushes, certain the shot was precise. For a brief moment, I allowed myself a sense of triumph. This was the kind of trophy hunters dream about, a remarkable specimen, taken cleanly, I waited, still perched in the tree. A responsible hunter never rushes to a downed animal. It's crucial to ensure the shot was effective, to avoid trailing an animal that might panic and flee in pain. After a few minutes, I climbed down and approached the spot where I'd last seen the buck. Its body wasn't immediately visible, so I followed broken branches and fresh marks in the soil. That's when I caught sight of it lying on its side. The antlers were even more impressive up close. The animal was indeed down, but something felt different. The forest seemed oddly silent. Not the usual hush of creatures scattering after a gunshot. This was more like a suspended moment, a hush that felt unnatural. Cautiously, I inched closer. Normally, I'd confirm the condition of my catch and begin the careful process of field dressing. This time, something made me hesitate. I saw dark fluid around the wound. It looked thicker than normal, with a strange color I couldn't immediately identify. Still, I chalked it up to some odd reflection of light. My main goal was to ensure the animal was truly gone. I poked its shoulder with the barrel of my rifle. No reaction. I reached over to touch its neck, planning to check for any sign of movement. That's when I felt a twitch beneath my fingers. The animal's leg kicked out once in a final convulsion. I stepped back, uneasy. Then it went still again. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that animals can sometimes experience reflexive movements after a fatal shot. I knelt, prepared to tag and dress the buck. As my knife touched its hide, I felt something shift. The animal's torso moved in a jerky, almost mechanical way. Its eyes opened, and though they were unfocused, they didn't look right. They had a milky glaze, and the lids seemed stuck halfway, as if lacking the normal reflexes. The buck's mouth opened as if it tried to take a breath. I pulled my hands back, startled. The creature began to twitch all over, limbs flailing in odd angles. In my years as a hunter, I had never seen anything like this. A shot that precise at that range should have ended things humanely and quickly. But this was different. It looked more like an unnatural reanimation than a creature clinging to life. I took a few steps back, trying to process what was unfolding. Suddenly, the buck rolled onto its belly, hind legs struggling to stand. Black droplets spilled from its chest, staining the grass and leaves. Despite the mortal injury, it was upright. The antlers swayed as it tried to lift its head. Instincts took over. I raised my rifle and aimed for a second shot, certain that I needed to end its suffering. I squeezed the trigger again. The sound echoed, and the animal slumped forward. This time I expected it to go still, but even that wasn't enough. It spasmed, let out a low rasping sound, and pushed itself upright once more. Confusion overwhelmed me. This could not be real. I checked my rifle, ensuring everything was in working order. My ammunition was standard, the same I'd used successfully for years. None of it made sense. The creature's eyes fixed in my direction, and it took 2 shaky steps forward. Each movement left a trail of that thick fluid, creating a bizarre pattern on the ground. I fired again and again, each shot carefully placed. Every time it would drop, then attempt to rise once more. Eventually, it fell flat, and its limbs stopped moving, giving me a moment to breathe. Though I tried to keep steady, I felt uncertain about everything I'd learned in a lifetime of hunting. Stepping in slowly, I leaned down. The buck lay still, but its eyes were locked in an open position, a glazed look that felt like it was staring right through me. Fluid continued to seep from its wounds in a slow, unsettling manner. I felt compelled to confirm it was truly at rest, but fear of it suddenly lashing out kept me at a distance. Minutes passed. The evening light grew dim. I finally dared to place a boot near its hind leg, nudging gently. No response. I had no choice but to process this confusing situation. Eventually, I decided I couldn't leave it there, not without finishing what I'd started. A responsible hunter does not abandon a kill, but how do you proceed with an animal that refuses to stay down? I retrieved some rope from my pack and worked quickly. If it showed signs of life again, I didn't want to be caught off guard. Once I was certain it wasn't moving, I rolled it onto a tarp, securing it as best as I could. The act felt deeply unsettling, like touching something that no longer belonged to this world. The buck's body was unnaturally cool and its eyes never closed. I tried my best to avoid making eye contact with that pale stare. I decided to drag it back toward my truck, rather than perform any field dressing. I wanted to get it to a safer location, maybe examine it under proper light. The trek was arduous, and nightfall crept in quickly. By the time I reached the truck, the last remnants of daylight were gone. I hoisted the buck into the bed, straining with the effort, and then took a moment to compose myself. Before starting the engine, I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror. The shape in the truck bed shifted, or so I believed. I sat frozen, watching for any sign that the buck was about to stand up. Nothing happened, so I dismissed it as a trick of the shadows, yet the uneasy feeling lingered. The drive home was quiet, except for the rumble of the tires. I usually felt a sense of accomplishment after a good hunt, but this time it was replaced by a sour taste of apprehension. Streetlights were sparse on the old road, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness. Every now and then I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the buck rise once more. I reached my property well after midnight. My cabin sits near the edge of a large woodland area, a perfect spot for a hunter to live. I parked near a floodlight that illuminated the driveway. Carefully, I approached the truck bed. The buck lay exactly where I'd placed it, eyes still open. My rifle, reloaded, was slung over my shoulder, just in case. I lowered the tailgate and examined the ropes. They were intact, not a single knot undone. The buck's body was limp, and now I noticed an odd odor, something faint and stale. It wasn't the usual metallic tang that might accompany a successful hunt. I unwrapped part of the tarp for a closer look. The wound no longer leaked anything. Instead, there was a thick residue caked around it. Everything about this creature felt wrong. In my workshop, I had a large table meant for processing game. Normally, I'd be prepared with plastic sheeting and the necessary tools, but tonight, I was hesitant to do any of that. Still, a part of me wanted to understand what I was dealing with. Was this some bizarre infection? Had I unknowingly shot something that was already ill? With careful effort, I transferred the buck onto the table, ropes still in place. The floodlight above hummed softly. I decided to remove the tarp fully. The creature's limbs flopped unnaturally, almost as though the joints were loose. The fluid that had dried around its wounds had a texture akin to old tar. Its eyes, still open, seemed lifeless, yet fixated on something beyond my comprehension. I debated whether to call a wildlife expert or a local official, but it was the middle of the night, and I wasn't sure how to explain this without sounding irrational. Perhaps the best course of action was to wait until morning, when I could bring someone out here to witness it. So I left the buck securely tied, covering it partially with a tarp to keep it hidden from any curious nocturnal animals. Then I locked up the workshop and headed inside my cabin. Sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I recalled the way it stood back up despite bullet wounds that should have been conclusive. I replayed the motion of its limbs jerking in that strange mechanical way. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I sat up in bed, staring at the walls, focusing on the faint ticking of a clock to keep myself grounded. At first light, I got dressed and returned to the workshop. Sunbeams cut through the trees, illuminating the driveway. I checked my phone for a signal, thinking I should probably call the nearest Fish and Game office. I wanted someone with expertise to examine this animal, but I discovered that my phone had lost its charge during the night. I couldn't remember leaving it on for that long, and the battery had been full when I went to bed. It seemed like a small inconvenience, so I plugged it in and made my way outside. My workshop's padlock was still in place, exactly how I'd left it. I unlatched the door and stepped inside. The sunlight spilled across the table where I'd left the buck. It was gone. The ropes lay severed in multiple places as though gnawed or frayed from immense force. The tarp was thrown aside, half crumpled on the floor. I scanned the room, rifle in hand. certain I'd find a corner where it might have collapsed, but there was no trace. The door had been locked from the outside, so if it escaped, it didn't exit through that path. My only other guess was a small window near the ceiling, but the thought of a large buck climbing through such a space felt impossible. Yet there was a clue. Dark smears on the concrete, leading toward the back wall. There, I noticed a large crack, possibly caused by years of settling. Something had forced its way through, leaving behind a trail of that thick residue. I approached cautiously, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The crack wasn't wide enough for a full-grown deer to pass, unless it somehow contorted itself in an unnatural way. I crouched to examine the marks. The concrete around the crack was chipped, as if something powerful had pushed or kicked it from the inside. A few tufts of fur were caught on the jagged edges. It confirmed that the buck had indeed gone through, but how? In any normal circumstance, an injured deer, especially one with multiple bullet wounds, would either be still or in dire straits. This one had enough strength to break out of a locked workshop and vanish into the surrounding woods. The more I tried to reason about it, the less logical everything became. I ran back to my cabin, hoping my phone had charged enough to make a call. As I hurried inside, I felt that strange hush in the air again, as though the forest was holding its breath. My phone was charged to a usable level now, so I dialed a contact at the local fish and game department. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried another line, a friend who sometimes patrolled these areas, but no luck. The calls rang out without answer. Left with no immediate assistance, I decided to track the creature myself. My mind was spinning with questions. Was it infected with some kind of disease? Was it even alive in the conventional sense? I couldn't ignore what had happened. I collected additional gear, a sidearm, extra ammunition, a flashlight, and a portable radio. Then I followed the clues. Behind the workshop, the forest thickens, full of brambles and dense undergrowth. Faint streaks of the strange residue led deeper among the trees. I noticed bent branches and flattened grass, suggesting the buck's path. The sight of these markings reminded me of a wounded animal's trail, but with the difference that it seemed unwavering in direction. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose. As I ventured deeper, daylight began to fade behind a thick canopy. The entire area was cast in a dim green glow. Though I walked carefully, the usual forest sounds felt muted, as if every creature was hiding. I occasionally spotted fresh smears on tree trunks or the ground. Each new discovery confirmed that I was on the right track, but it also fueled my unease. Eventually, the trail led to a clearing I'd never come across before. In the center, I saw the collapsed remains of a small shack. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years, maybe used long ago by loggers or trappers. The walls were splintered, and the roof sagged at a dangerous angle. I slowed my pace, studying the area. The residue trail led inside, through what had once been a doorway. I paused, unsure if entering was wise, but I couldn't turn back after coming this far. I took a deep breath, steadied my rifle, and stepped inside. The interior smelled stale and damp, a mix of rotting wood and something else that raised alarms in my mind. Wooden beams were broken or rotted through. Light filtered in through holes in the roof, illuminating patches of the dirt floor. Against one wall, I noticed a large mound covered in leaves, branches, and other forest debris. Something about it looked like a makeshift nest. I approached, noticing a dark shape beneath the layers of debris. Carefully, I used a stick to brush some of it away. There, partially covered, was the buck. It lay motionless, sides heaving in a slow, unnatural rhythm. The bullet wounds were still visible, caked with that tar-like substance. Its eyes were closed for once, yet the lids flickered as though it was experiencing some kind of internal struggle. Observing it like this felt surreal, almost as if I'd stumbled onto some hidden corner of the forest where normal rules did not apply. The buck's body expanded and contracted at a painstakingly slow pace, like it was drawing shallow breaths, but not in a normal pattern. I debated ending this once and for all. However, a deeper part of me wanted to know what was causing this creature's behavior. Was it suffering from an unknown pathogen? Could it be some mutation? I searched the shack for clues. Near the collapsed wall, I found crates that seemed decades old. Rummaging through them, I discovered a few corroded tools, empty cans, and a ragged notebook. Most pages were stuck together or ruined by moisture, but a few words were still legible. Phrases like "not normal," "keeps moving," and "hunter's gone." It was impossible to piece together a coherent story from the fragments, but it seemed like whoever had once stayed here experienced something similar. Maybe not with a buck, but with something that refused to stay down. A thud behind me snapped my attention back. The buck had stirred, one hoof scraping the dirt floor. Its eyes were open again, that milky glaze returning. It attempted to stand. With considerable effort, it rose to its feet, swaying and unsteady. For a moment, I wondered if it recognized me as a threat, or if it even recognized anything at all. It took a few steps, black residue dripping from its mouth. Its head turned towards me in a slow, deliberate motion. The antlers, though broken in places from its struggle at the workshop, still looked formidable. I aimed my rifle, but part of me hesitated. Was I dealing with a disease that spread on contact? What if a single shot wasn't enough? I backed away, trying to maintain a safe distance. The buck lumbered closer, movements disjointed. The front legs moved while the hind legs delayed, as if every part of its body was receiving signals at different times. Its gaze, however, stayed focused in my direction. The time for caution ended when it gathered enough balance to charge. Its speed was less than a healthy animal, but still more than I could outrun in close quarters. I squeezed the trigger twice, striking its center mass. The impact spun it to the side, but it continued forward, smashing through a rotted beam. I dove to the ground, feeling bits of splintered wood showering around me. The shack groaned under the impact, and part of the roof caved in. Dust filled the air, forcing me to cough. I scrambled to my feet, searching for the buck through the swirling debris. A shape lunged from the right, and I fired again out of reflex. The shot connected, and it collapsed once more. This time, it didn't try to rise immediately. I rushed outside, needing clearer space. My breathing was ragged and my arms felt shaky from adrenaline. The shack creaked ominously on the verge of complete collapse. Through a gap in the wall, I spotted the buck thrashing on the floor, pinned under a fallen rafter. Its limbs scraped across the ground, but it couldn't free itself. A logical part of me demanded I leave it trapped and find some form of help. But if this creature could free itself once, it might do so again. I decided to use the final measure. From a safe distance, I lined up my shot and fired at its head. The thrashing slowed, then eventually stopped. Stillness returned to the shack. I waited, counting the seconds. With everything I'd seen, I knew it was wise to confirm. So I circled around, taking a vantage point by a gaping hole in the shack's side. The buck lay there, unmoving, pinned under rubble. Its eyes were half open, but the unnatural flicker was gone. No drip of that odd substance moved from its wounds. With trembling caution, I approached. The entire scene felt like stepping into a nightmare. I probed the creature with a long branch, expecting it to jolt awake. It remained still. At that point, I believed it was finally over. Yet the forest around me offered no sense of relief. Birds didn't sing, small animals didn't stir. It was as if nature itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I surveyed the damage in the shack, noticing the hazard of further collapse. My plan became clear. Get back to the cabin, call for help, and have professionals deal with this bizarre situation. Any normal wildlife official would want to examine the remains, take samples, and figure out what kind of infection or phenomenon caused it to keep rising. Gathering myself, I left the shack and began to retrace my steps. Even though the sun was still up, the gloom of the forest seemed thicker than before. The return trip took longer, possibly because I checked every noise and every movement around me. It felt like something was watching, as if the forest had eyes of its own. When I finally reached my cabin, I rushed to find my phone. This time, it was completely unresponsive. The battery was drained again, and the charger hadn't made any difference. All my attempts to turn it on failed. That's when I realized my landline, which I hadn't used in months, might be my only option. I picked it up to hear nothing. No dial tone, just silence. My next thought was to jump in my truck and drive to the nearest ranger station. But as I approached my vehicle, I noticed the driver's side window was shattered. Fragments of glass littered the seat. Something had been inside. The hood was scratched, the metal marked by ragged lines. A rancid smell lingered in the air, making it difficult to breathe properly. Had the buck followed me earlier in the night? Or was there something else out here, infected in the same way? My pulse thundered in my ears as I opened the door. The interior was in disarray. Upholstery ripped, the steering column damaged. It wouldn't start. The engine refused to turn over, and the entire dashboard flickered erratically before dying. I was stranded. With no phone, no vehicle, and no certainty about what else might be lurking, I realized I needed to fortify my cabin and prepare for the worst. My supplies were limited, but I had enough food and water for a short time. I set about reinforcing doors, nailing boards over windows, and creating makeshift barricades. Each swing of the hammer felt urgent. Each board hammered into place a small measure of security. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that set every nerve on edge. I triple-checked my ammunition, loaded my rifle, and placed my sidearm at the table beside me. A lantern provided dim light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest grew darker, the silhouettes of trees swaying like ominous figures. Time crawled. I sat by a window quietly listening. Occasionally, I'd detect branches snapping or leaves rustling. It could have been any forest creature, but given what I'd encountered, my imagination ran wild. What if there were more infected animals out there? Deer, wolves, or even bears? The thought of a large predator with the same unstoppable condition kept me on constant alert. Midnight arrived with no major disturbances. I allowed myself to think maybe it was over, that the buck's final end in that shack had broken the cycle. Then, just as I started to lower my guard, a noise at the front door made me freeze. Something was scratching, slowly and methodically, as if testing the barrier. I raised my rifle and approached the door, trying to peer through the small gap in the boards. A shape moved on the porch, hunched and broad-shouldered. I caught a glimpse of pale eyes reflecting the lantern light. My mind instantly flashed back to the buck's eyes, that milky glaze. Could it be another infected creature? My hands trembled around the rifle's stock, uncertain if I should open fire through the door. Suddenly, the shape slammed into the door, rattling the hinges. I stepped back, heart thudding against my ribs, careful not to use the exact phrase that YouTube might dislike. The next slam cracked one of the boards. In a surge of desperation, I fired. The noise reverberated through the cabin. The shape outside let out a low, hollow moan and staggered away from the entrance. Silence followed. I waited in the gloom, every sense strained. Slowly I approached a window to see if it was gone. Nothing moved. I considered searching outside, but caution got the better of me. Instead, I spent the rest of that night in a state of watchful stillness, rifle never leaving my side. When dawn finally broke, I ventured onto the porch. The boards on the door were splintered, and there were dark smears on the wood. The ground revealed large footprints mixed with something else that looked more like hoofprints. It seemed multiple things had circled my cabin during the night. My mind swirled with questions. Were they infected animals? Some hybrid creature? I resolved to leave. Staying put was too dangerous. Yet my truck was unusable, and my phone was dead. The nearest ranger station was miles away through thick woodland. Given the circumstances, however, it felt like my only chance. I packed a small bag with essentials, loaded my weapons, and prepared for a trek. Before I set off, I heard a faint noise from the tree line. I raised my rifle, scanning the area, but saw nothing. so I started walking. The forest greeted me with that uneasy hush again. I followed the main dirt road for as long as I could, constantly checking my surroundings. My plan was to reach the highway, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle or find a spot with a signal. Along the way, I found new evidence of strange encounters: patches of dried black residue on the ground, tree bark stripped in wide, ragged patterns, and footprints that seemed neither fully human nor fully animal. Each discovery intensified my sense that the infection, or whatever it was, extended beyond a single buck. It felt like the entire forest was falling under a shadow. Eventually, the road curved around a slope, offering a partial overlook of the valley. Smoke rose in the distance, too much to be a normal campfire. It looked like a series of plumes, possibly from cabins or small homes scattered throughout the region. An unsettling realization took hold. I might not be alone in this nightmare. Others could be facing the same horrors or worse. Pressing on, I clung to the hope that the ranger station still operated. If I could reach it, perhaps they had a radio capable of calling for assistance. Even if the local cell towers were down, or if there was an unexplained disruption, a ranger station often kept alternative communication methods. The hike was strenuous, and every rustling leaf or snapping twig kept me on edge. I climbed a small ridge, and as I crested the top, I spotted movement below, an entire herd of deer. At first glance, they looked normal, grazing near a stream. I watched from a safe distance, unsure if I dared approach. Then, I noticed one that moved with an awkward gait, stumbling but continuing forward. Another lifted its head, revealing clouded eyes, much like the buck I had encountered. This infection was spreading. A wave of dread swept over me. If it was spreading among wildlife, how could anyone contain it? The herd didn't react to me, which is unusual for deer. They simply continued in their slow, odd way, as if drawn by some instinct. I chose to leave them be, circling around to avoid contact. Infected or not, a herd of animals that size could be very dangerous. Nightfall found me deeper in the woods, with no sign of the ranger station yet. I set up a small camp, but sleep was out of the question. I kept a low-profile fire, carefully shielded by rocks and brush. The darkness came alive with subtle movements, occasional calls of distant creatures, and that faint wind rustling overhead. I stayed on high alert, rifle balanced on my knee. At some point I must have dozed off, because a sudden crack of branches jolted me. My eyes snapped open, and I saw a figure on the far edge of my makeshift camp. It resembled a person, standing just at the line where firelight faded into darkness. Its stance was unnaturally still, and I couldn't make out features. I froze, not wanting to startle it or draw it closer. Slowly the figure turned and drifted back among the trees. It didn't run or walk with normal strides. It floated in uneven steps, as if each joint operated independently. Once it vanished, I was left with only my own shaky breath and the crackle of the fire. It reaffirmed my decision to keep moving at daybreak, no matter how exhausted I felt. Morning came, and I continued the journey. After several more hours of hiking, I reached a sign indicating the ranger station was only 2 miles ahead. Relief washed over me at the thought of finally contacting someone. But as I drew closer, I noticed a heavy gloom. Smoke curled from the building's chimney, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. I approached the station, a small log structure with a watchtower adjacent to it. The door stood ajar, creaking on its hinges. My calls for anyone inside echoed in emptiness. Stepping over the threshold, I saw scattered papers, a knocked-over chair, and signs of a struggle. Dark residue stained the floor near the back wall. A radio sat on the counter, silent and powerless. Searching the station, I found no sign of the Rangers. The generator outside was running, but the radio tower's cables had been torn away, as if by large claws. A sense of defeat hit me. This place was supposed to be a sanctuary, and it too was compromised. I climbed the watchtower, hoping for a vantage point. From there, the forest stretched in every direction, majestic yet tainted by this new reality. I saw columns of smoke here and there, likely from other cabins or vehicles. No one was in sight. My only option was to keep going, maybe reach a main road that would lead to the nearest town. Sitting up there, I realized how massive the forest truly was. The distance I had to travel seemed monumental. Before leaving, I scoured the station one last time for supplies. A bit of canned food, some water, and an old map. The map showed a route that might lead to a highway about 10 miles away. With a heavy resolve, I packed my findings and descended the tower. Now, as I record these events in my journal, uncertain if it will ever be read, I acknowledge that what I experienced in the forest challenges everything I once believed about life and nature. The buck that refused to stay down was just the beginning. Something is spreading, transforming animals into relentless beings, and possibly affecting humans too. I can't explain how it started or what caused it. All I know is that it's real, and it's out there. My journey continues. I move through the forest by day, resting only when I must. Always alert to any rustle of leaves that might signal an infected creature. The nights are filled with half-seen shapes and unsettling sounds. My food supplies dwindle, and I hold on to the hope that I can find an untouched area, maybe an outpost or a working phone. Even if I survive, I don't know what future awaits. Will the infection spread across the region, or is it already doing so beyond my knowledge? I share my story here in the faint hope that someone will hear it. Let it serve as a warning to anyone who ventures into these woods. The things you hunt might not abide by the rules of nature anymore. Bullets can stop them for a moment, but they may rise again, driven by a force we do not understand. If you find yourself walking along an old trail, catching sight of an animal with clouded eyes, or hearing a hollow call through the pines, remember this account. Your best option might be to turn back and leave the forest behind, because once you step into this realm of uncertainty, there's no guarantee you'll come out unchanged. I was a trophy hunter, guided by skill and tradition. Now I'm just someone trying to outlast a phenomenon that defies logic. The forest no longer feels like the place I once knew. Everything stands shrouded in a mystery that defies the natural order. If you're hearing this, take heed. There are entities out here that challenge our understanding of life and mortality. For them, the moment of ending is only temporary, and the next rise may come sooner than you think. That's all for now. But don't mistake the end of the story for the end of the nightmare. If you're still listening, like, comment and subscribe. Keep the signal alive. And remember, in a world like this, the real horror begins when the voices go silent.